Welcome to today's event entitled Iran's Deepening Ties with China and Russia. This is our first public program of the new year. We're pleased to be so timely with an event treating Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the involvement of outside powers in the Gulf region. Today's event has been organized in co-sponsorship with the Conflict Management Program here at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. We're very grateful for our continuing collaboration with SAIS as we start 2016. Before I introduce and turn over the program to our moderator, a member of the SAIS faculty, I would like to encourage all of you to attend our next public event on Tuesday, January 12th. MEI scholar Thomas Lipman will speak about his new book about Anwar Sadat entitled Hero of the Crossing. The book will be on sale, and Tom will be signing copies after his discussion with the audience. Space is rather limited for this event. It's at the MEI building over on N Street. So please go to our website at your earliest convenience and register to attend. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Camille Pecastaing, Senior Associate Professor of Middle East Studies here at SAIS. You have his bio and those of today's panelists in the flyer we put out at the registration table, I hope. I will say simply that Camille is a respected and very popular professor here at SAIS and the author of numerous scholarly journal articles, book chapters, and web publications. He writes, among other topics, on Middle Eastern issues and on understanding the phenomenon of terrorism. We at MEI are delighted to work with him for the first time. I will leave it to Camille to introduce today's panelists and lead us through the program. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again very much for joining us today. Camille, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for your introduction. In the name of Middle East Institute and Johns Hopkins University, welcome. Welcome to SAIS. As we just heard, it's a very topical panel that we have today. For many decades, the Gulf has been a British and an American sea as far as foreign powers, superpowers go. But for the last 2-3 years, things have been kind of funny and things have been brewing. And they sort of came to a clash quite recently over the last 10 days. So a lot of things are happening, and we just have a wide range of expertise here to bring some light over what's happening in the region. So we're going to have 4 speakers covering 4 different actors. The first two, the full bios are on the document that you have, so I'll really provide a very brief introduction. The first speaker will be Alex Vatanka, who's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, and he will give us the story from the point of view of Tehran. Then we will hear from John Garver, a professor emeritus of international affairs at Georgia Institute of Technology. He's also the author of this monumental history, China's Quest, published at Oxford University Press, who's the ultimate history of Chinese foreign relations since it became a communist country of the Public Republic of China. And obviously, he's going to tell us the story from the point of view of the People's Republic of China. Then we will hear from Stephen Blank, who's a senior fellow at the American Foreign Policy Council, who will give us the story from Russia. And finally, we will hear from Fahad Nazer, who's a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf State Institute in Washington, who will bring the story from the actor who's not in the title, but just absolutely key to what's going on right now in the region, which is Saudi Arabia. So without further ado, I give the floor to Mr. Vatanka.
Good morning, almost good afternoon. Thank you very much, Camille. Thank you all very much for coming. I had actually intended to talk much more about Iran versus Russia and China, but because of events on Sunday in Tehran, what I'm going to try and do is to focus a little bit more specifically on the sort of foreign policy struggle that's going on in the corridors of power in Tehran. So when I was preparing my remarks, I thought to myself, well, actually, let me tell you this. This morning, President Rouhani decided to stop all import from Saudi Arabia. His cabinet chose to do that deliberately. They had the option not to go down that path. And that made me wonder, why did Rouhani do that? And the very clear conclusion that one gets to is because he has no other options domestically at home. The Saudi issue is going to become a problem for him, and he's decided to go ahead and sort of almost mirror the hardliners in terms of the positioning himself vis-a-vis the Saudis. But I can also equally guarantee you it was not the foreign ministry or the presidential palace in Tehran that in any way gave the green light for an attack on the Saudi embassy on Sunday. That was something that totally surprised Rouhani. And now he's kind of fallen victim to this set of events. So briefly, in the 5-10 minutes I have, I would like to talk about Rouhani's problems at home and internationally. Then if I could talk to the likely forces that might have attacked the Saudi embassy, why they did it, and where do they stand on the issue today. And then finally, and I know Stephen and John obviously going to delve into the Russian-China angles much more extensively than I will, but I'll also talk about where Russia's and China fit in all this. Look, the fact of the matter is the timing of this attack on the Saudi embassy was awful from Rouhani's perspective. Here is a guy who has been working basically for the last 24 months trying to get a nuclear deal in place. He achieves that despite all the opposition that he faced in Tehran. And now he's weeks away from having the sanctions lifted. Why is the lifting of the sanctions so important for him? Because the second most important pledge he made in 2013 when he became president was, let me go out there and negotiate a nuclear deal, and once I've done that, I will fix the Iranian economy. So he's getting this close to a moment where sanctions will be lifted on Iran, and what happens? About a few hundreds of basically hoodlums in the streets of outside of the embassy in Tehran decide to climb the walls. This creates a huge image problem for Rouhani. At least from the perspective of the Rouhani team, what this does is limits their options in terms of attracting foreign investment. And attracting foreign investment, which might come as a bit of a surprise to you, is actually a huge policy objective by the Rouhani team. They see immediate correlation between attracting foreign investment and fixing the economy, particularly for the oil and gas sector, where the Iranians are not able to actually get the oil and the gas up and produce and get the revenue the way they can if they had help. So here's Hassan Rouhani since 14th of July when the nuclear agreement was signed. Basically what has happened in Iran is the hardliners have decided to stop fighting him on the nuclear issue, or are now attacking him on his lack of progress on the economy. And I think what this attack on the embassy does basically is it's tying his hands, because it continues to keep Iran isolated. At least the hope seems to be among certain hardliners in Iran that this sort of action will limit Rouhani's options. And what does that do? That basically, again, from the perspective of the hardliners, provides momentum for their narrative. And what is that hardline narrative? That hardline narrative is Hassan Rouhani went out there, negotiated with West, provided excessive concessions with a single promise that he's going to fix the economy. He's going to fix the economy quickly. But what does he actually have to show for it? He's been in office since 2013, and he's got nothing to show for it. And they point to specific economic indicators, and largely they're right. The hardliners are right. The Iranian economy is not doing well. So I think if you look at this in the context of the upcoming elections in February, both parliamentary elections and the elections for the Assembly of Experts, this sort of line of attack on Rouhani is important, and he needs to both position himself and, if he can, seek to neutralize him. Now, let me turn quickly to the likely forces, and I say likely because really nobody knows at this point who was behind the attack on the Saudi embassy. But if you go to Sunday, the guy who basically, in my mind, gave the green light for this attack was the Supreme Leader of Iran himself, Ayatollah Khamenei. Ayatollah Khamenei comes out and talks about divine vengeance against the Saudis, and within hours you have the Saudi embassy attacked. We haven't heard from the Supreme Leader since. If you ask me why that is, I think he probably very quickly realized that was a mistake on his part. And when I look at Ayatollah Khamenei's position on this sheikh, the Saudi sheikh, Sheikh Nimr, I actually looked Sheikh Nimr up on Khamenei's website. There is one reference to Sheikh Nimr's on Khamenei's website. One reference, and that's from the 3rd of January. So the idea that Sheikh Nimr, for some reason for Khamenei, was this big grand hero, and that's why he's picked up this fight with the Saudis, doesn't make sense. Sheikh Nimr doesn't play a big role in Khamenei's worldview up till the 3rd of January, and then suddenly he becomes this issue that he feels so strongly about. Which begs the question, why 3rd of January? Why make a big deal out of it? Now I think, again, this takes us back to domestic politics in Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran needs a couple of issues as sort of targets in order to attack those targets and justify its own existence. For the last 36 years, the United States played that role. Now with this nuclear agreement, the United States and Iran talking to one another, that taboo is almost broken down. So it seems to me, at least, that there are people in Tehran who are looking for that next boogeyman, and Saudi Arabia fits the bill perfectly, both for Khamenei, but also for Khamenei's closest political allies in Tehran, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, who happen to be the folks, the generals, who are actually fighting the Saudis face-to-face in battle zones like Iraq and in Syria. So I definitely see the IRGC and Khamenei, the Supreme Leader's Office, coming together on this issue and trying to sort of sideline Rouhani. And there's, as I said, there's a lot of domestic political motivations behind what's going on here. Look, let me say something also about what all this means for Iran's relations with Russia and China. And I'm sorry I couldn't talk more about that, but again, we're overtaken by events. This two school of thought that we have in Iran today, let's call them the Western-centric ones. That's the Rouhani team. That's the foreign ministry, the presidential palace. They are faced with the Supreme Leader's Office and the IRGC. And there is a clear difference in terms of preference. Rouhani and his team have been saying since they came to office very clearly, look, our biggest problem and the biggest threat to the survival of the Islamic Republic isn't cultural invasion by the United States and this and the other. It's the state of the economy. Who can fix this economy? Who can bring the investment? Who can bring the know-how and the expertise? It's not going to be the likes of Russia and China. It's going to be the West. So you see a clear tendency on their part and preference for Western firms. Now, the Supreme Leader's Office gets that, and to a large extent has allowed those sort of negotiations to go forward. He's got one exception, a very notable exception, and that's the United States, where he says, talk to anybody except the United States, because he fears any kind of inroad or America making inroads into Iran will come at his expense. So he said, yeah, talk to the English, to the French, to the Italians, anybody except the Americans. And so far, it seems that Rouhani has listened to that advice, or at least respects it, at least in his public stance. The Revolutionary Guards people also get it, also do not want to be in the way of foreign investment, Western investment coming in. They also appreciate that the economy needs a good kick. But they seem to be saying, let's limit it. Let's limit it to the extent that it's possible from their perspective, and let it not be at our expense. And what do I mean by at our expense? So if you look at the Ahmadinejad period from 2005 onwards, that's the period where the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, actually economically gets involved in the Iranian economy like it's never done before. You got literally hundreds of companies that are affiliated to the IRGC, and these guys are starting to make money. Now they're fearing Rouhani's people, this new administration that came in 2013, is going to try and give some of those projects and the income that they were getting to their allies who are looking to Western firms for partnership. So essentially, again, it's a domestic issue here too, where the IRGC certainly has had much better relations with Chinese and Russian firms than with Western firms. So I think what I wanted to say about that is, President Rouhani is not against Russia or China. He came to office with a simple, basically message on those two countries. He said, look, they're important countries. They're important trading partners. They can't be ignored. We will trade with them. I mean, how can you take China out of the Iranian economy? It's 1/3 of Iran's overall trade, about $50 billion. You can't replace China with anyone else. That's a fact of life. But what Rouhani's team are saying to the hardliners is that you need to get additional partners so you don't become beholden to the Chinese. And that's the point they're trying to sell. And increasingly, they're trying to also do exactly the same thing with Russia. Russia is an important player. Russia provides certain expertise and goods, particularly on the military side, that they need. But Russia cannot go in and fix up Iran's ailing oil and gas sector, which is basically the heart of the Iranian economy. So this is where we are today. You got an awkward position where Rouhani did not want to be side-blinded, and he was essentially by this attack on Sunday. The hardliners, on the other hand, seem also, going by the number of hardliners who have come out and actually denounced this attack, seem to have maybe quickly realized this was not the right thing to do. I mean, when I was looking at the reactions, it kind of reminded me of the Salman Rushdie affair. You know, the Salman Rushdie affair was Ayatollah Khomeini came out and denounced this British author and said, you know, he kind of issued a fatwa that killed the guy. And very quickly, the wiser heads in Iran realized the cost that Iran was going to pay for that kind of decision. Khamenei might have had a moment where he realized, actually, me coming out against the Saudis as hard as I did, essentially allowing for the embassy to be attacked, might provide more opportunity for Iran to be isolated, particularly pushed by Iran's rivals like Saudi Arabia. And that seems to me, at least to me, why there was that very quick decision to pull back. And now it's very difficult to see where we're going to go from here onwards. But I have a feeling that Hassan Rouhani cannot afford to appear to be soft on the Saudis. Domestically, that's impossible for him. He needs to make sure he focuses on the economy. At this moment right now in Tehran, it's easier to say good things about the United States, or perhaps even Israel, than it is to say about Saudi Arabia. That's how sensitive the issue has become. So I think those differences that I outlined for you really are, they exist, they're real, and they're going to have implications. But in the short term, I don't expect that Rouhani will be able to have the space necessary to do much in terms of independence thinking on the issue of what to do with Saudi Arabia. Let me stop there and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Garver.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm honored to be here, and let me begin by thanking the Middle Eastern Institute and Alex Vatanka and Mark Strickland for inviting me, and thank the JHU-SAIS for hosting us today. I've been asked to talk about the future of Iran-China relations, and I've learned over the years that I'm really not very good at prognostication. I'm much better at historical analysis than predicting the future. So what I tried to do is try to integrate some recent history with what might occur in the future in China-Iran relations. And let me begin with a talk by the Chinese ambassador to Iran, Peng Liu, in March of last year, March 2015. Cue the slides. So this is the Chinese ambassador to Iran in March 2015, several months before the deal is concluded, the Iran nuclear deal in July, 14 July. And this comes, of course, and the talks are moving forward at high speed, but the deal hasn't been signed. There's still possibility of collapse. And this is the comments by China's ambassador to Iran to a session of the Iranian-Chinese Friendship Association. Now, as you may know, friendship diplomacy has played an important role in China's diplomacy ever since 1949. Oh, and the book on China's diplomatic history, I recommend it to you. There's some flyers about it on the table in the foyer. But you know, the friendship associations around the world are organizations by people who are supportive of greater cooperation with China, and they play an important role in China's global diplomacy. There are probably 100 or so China-U.S. friendship associations around the United States, and they're attended by people from the Chinese consulate and so forth. And this session of the Sino-Iranian Friendship, or the Iranian-Chinese Friendship Association, to which Ambassador Peng Liu addressed, was chaired by a deputy foreign minister of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And Peng Liu begins this important talk at this critical juncture by talking about Iran and China being great civilizations, what I call civilizational rhetoric. And I wrote a book in 2006 titled China and Iran. And I start with the queer function of this civilizational rhetoric in China-Iran diplomacy. At critical junctures in Iran-China relations, when they collapsed after the fall of the Shah, or the onset of negotiations over the Iran-Iraq war, at critical junctures in Iran-China relations, this civilizational rhetoric comes to the fore. And the Chinese view of this is that this lubricates China's cooperation with other countries by establishing a common basis of emotion, ganqing in Chinese. And the way it works is you first establish a common emotion, and then you leverage this common emotion to common policy positions, and the common policy positions then open the vistas to expanded cooperation and so forth. So there was, Ambassador Peng began with this talk about civilizational rhetoric. Then he went to talk about the common language. China and Iran have much common language. Now what that means, that's code for the history of the last century or so, the last 150 years of the two countries. And the idea here is that you have these great glittering civilizations, and that was a term that Ambassador Leo also used, these great glittering civilizations of non-Western civilizations, Persia and China, which are brought low by heinous Western imperialism and subjected to many indignities, and the common understanding and struggle against that, and so on and so forth. This is what the part of what the code, common views, common perspectives on international affairs mean. Oh, and what that means in the world today is that the People's Republic of China and the Islamic Republic of Iran both resent and reject the arrogance of the Western countries when they presume to tell countries like Persia and China, these glittering ancient civilizations, how they should run their own affairs. So you got it. So you have this civilizational rhetoric following to these common perspectives in world affairs. And then Ambassador Peng goes on to survey the broad vistas for expanded Chinese-Iranian economic cooperation as laid out in the summit meeting between Xi Jinping and President Rouhani in May 2014. About a year after Rouhani's election, Rouhani pays a state visit to China, and the two leaders, Xi Jinping and Rouhani, agree that there is broad vistas for expanded cooperation in terms of China's participation in the industrialization of Iran. And there's also the hidden code there, appropriate technology and so on and so forth, in the development of basic infrastructure, not only transportation, but telecommunication and education. There's broad vistas for expansion in security cooperation. And China has been Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran's second largest weapons supplier to Iran. Number one, of course, has been Russia. But China has certain military technology which was very useful to Iran in terms of confronting people like the United States Navy, in terms of sea mines. The People's Liberation Army Navy has very advanced, very potent sea mine capabilities, which obviously would be very useful to the Islamic Republic of Iran in the Gulf. Now, this wasn't laid out in the joint communique between Xi and Rouhani, but again, it's implicit in the diplomatic code that they use. So, Ambassador Peng, you get the picture here at this critical junction of the talk. Rouhani, Peng Liu, Ambassador Peng, lays out the broad vistas for cooperation. And then he moves to this. And this is the punchline. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, this is the ambassador of the People's Republic of China to the Islamic Republic of Iran, talking to this audience of friends of China, friends of advocates of China-Iran cooperation. And he says, Ambassador Peng says, in effect, this is the reality, ladies and gentlemen, my friends, I need to tell you. Just now, the Iran nuclear talks have reached a historic opportunity, favorable opportunity. If a friendly and comprehensive agreement can be achieved, this will create a more relaxed external environment and more investment opportunities. China has, from the start, taken an objective and fair position regarding the Iran nuclear talk and is happy if Iran and the six powers can reach an early comprehensive agreement. China will continue to play a constructive role and urge all parties to move forward with one another to reach an early and comprehensive agreement. In other words, China is willing to provide large-scale, generous, and effective assistance to Iran's development in multiple areas: infrastructure, transportation, industrialization, foreign trade, finance. And remember, it's about this time that China ponies up $45 billion to fund the development of a Pakistan economic corridor connecting Xinjiang and Kashgar and western Xinjiang with Gwadar in eastern Baluchistan. And it's just about this time that China's ponied up another tens of billions of dollars to establish the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the AIIB. China has big money. And what it's saying, we're willing to use these assets to accelerate Iran's industrial development, economic development, if the Iran nuclear issue can be comprehensively and fairly settled. In effect, China has laid, this goes from this specific speech back to the policy here. This is a Chinese carrot. This is a huge and luscious Chinese carrot to Iran, saying the reality is that the future of this expanded economic cooperation is dependent upon a comprehensive and permanent solution of the nuclear issue between Iran and the six powers. And if it can be set aside, if it can be settled, well, the vistas for expanded cooperation are great. A very prominent Chinese carrot. Now, the deeper context here is that China has long viewed Persia as a like-minded, friendly power, a great power in Eurasia. China's Persian cooperation goes back to the beginning of the Common Era, to before the Common Era, in the early, okay. The point I was going to make is that China looks at the world, it looks at Asia, and looks around Asia to see what countries, what powers in Asia would be friendly to China's rise as a great power, maybe the dominant power of Asia. Well, there's Japan. Not going to be Japan. There's Russia. Not a bad blood with Russia. There's India. That's not going to be India. The one Asian power, major power in Asia, which historically has a positive view of China's role as a great power in Asia, is Persia, Iran, Persia. And I think that the deep Chinese perspective on these current interactions are that China's long-term objective with Iran is to nurture over time an all-weather, multidimensional partnership with Iran based upon mutual understanding and trust, to develop with Iran a relationship like China has with Pakistan. But Pakistan is not a power. Iran is a power. And that's the long-term grand strategy of China in this. Now, of course, the subtext here is that Iran has to forego the acquisition of a nuclear weapon. And what this means is that, well, this is a genuine Chinese policy. I do think that China's emphasis on nuclear non-proliferation is probably less weighty than it is for the Americans, because China, after all, doesn't have troops stationed in the Middle East. It doesn't have security obligations in the Persian Gulf. It doesn't have allies in the Persian Gulf. The United States has all those things. So the United States has greater interest in nuclear non-proliferation. But if you look at Iran-China interactions of the last 20 years, Iranian officials, even under Ahmadinejad, repeatedly assured the Chinese that, no, we're not seeking nuclear weapons. And the Chinese would say on pointed occasions, we have taken note of your assurances and we are glad of them. Okay, the other factor, let's move to number 2. I have, what, 2 minutes? 1 minute.
2.5.
2.5 minutes. The other factor that brought China another factor which brought China into the game of the nuclear talks in 2012, 2013, 2014, was the danger of war. the danger of war. And here you had the fact that during the second Obama administration, the United States and Israel were preparing for the utilization of military means if a peaceful solution was not forthcoming. And from the perspective of China's cooler heads, a war in the Middle East would have been a disaster. This is from a program, a call-in program on the website Changguo Luntan, that is a Great Power Forum, run by the Chinese news agency and the Renminbi Bao, People's Daily of China. This is a call-in forum established by China's foreign ministry to rebut the nationalist comment and criticism of Chinese diplomacy that flows into the center. So this was a program hosted by China's foremost Iran hand in December 2012. That is before Rouhani's election, but as the secret talks between Iran and the United States are already underway, there's the possibility of a peaceful solution is still far from clear. And this is what this is the former Chinese ambassador to Iran, Hua Liming, was ambassador to Iran. He is probably China's top Iran hands. And this is what he had to say to this hot-headed nationalist caller in December 2012. If Iran and the United States, Israel, and Iran touch off a war over the nuclear issue, it will be a disaster for the Middle East region. Not only will Iran suffer a potentially lethal attack, and there's a lot of subtext there, not only will Iran suffer a potentially lethal attack, but the entire region will be consumed by the flames of war, because once Iran is attacked, it will definitely respond with counterattack. Then U.S. military bases and forces in the Persian Gulf, Iran, and Afghanistan will become targets of Iran attack, and the entire Middle East will be consumed by the flames of war. Again, this is China's former ambassador to Iran. This is China's top Iran hand talking. The Middle East is a major supplier of oil. 60% of the world's oil comes from the Middle East and the Persian and the Middle East. And the Middle East has become the world's most important oil transport lines. Once war breaks out in the area, 60% of the world oil supply will stop. The world economy will be severely injured. The world economy that is just beginning to recover will suffer an even greater disaster. China will be the first to suffer. Therefore, China does not want to see war break out in this region, but hopes for peace. Now, the caller that raised the question to which this response was, so if America wants to attack Iran and fight a war, why don't we let them? Why is that against China's interest? And that type of ultra-nationalist perspective is common in China. And this was Ambassador Hua Liming's response to this. Okay, here's the important conclusion. China's diplomacy on the Iran nuclear issue for the past several years was parallel and in tandem with the United States. China worked parallel with the United States in important and substantive ways to bring Iran to a deal, to settle the Iran nuclear issue. China's carrot was, if you settle the nuclear deal, China will provide robust, large-scale, and effective assistance to your development. If you don't settle the nuclear issue, the reality is our firms cannot help you. Settle the deal. Another aspect of Chinese diplomacy was actively lobbying Iran to come to terms. But the big point is that China worked in tandem, in parallel with the United States to achieve a peaceful settlement of the Iran nuclear, to bring Iran, let me put it this way, to bring Iran to terms over its nuclear programs. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
I'd like to thank Mark and Alex for inviting me and organizing this event. I want to talk about Russia and Iran. And if you're going to understand Russia's relationship with Iran, even before Moscow intervened in Syria in a big way on September 30th, you need to see it in terms of Russia's overall thinking and posture about the Middle East. From Moscow's point of view, Iran is a major player who is a neighbor, despite the fact that it is separated by the Caspian Sea or the Caucasus or Central Asia from Russia. And therefore, Russia has to find a way to live with it. Moreover, Iran can become a partner for Russia against the United States in particular, and the West in general. The Russian government, even before September, thought of itself as it either being or should be a great Middle Eastern power, just like the Soviet Union was before. And it recognized that it's going to have to work to get to that status and get it recognized by other players. And for that, it needs a partner. That partner is Iran, because Iran, for all the bad history that exists between Russia and Iran, and which nobody has forgotten on either side of the border, is the most overtly anti-American state in the region, and therefore the one most likely to respond favorably towards Russian initiatives that are also anti-American in their essence. And what's more, Russia, since at least, let's say, 1978, when the Camp David Agreement came into being, has tried to organize a coalition, or if you like, a bloc of states in the Middle East that would support its efforts to block the American determination to be the sole great power or security manager of the region. The older people in the audience will remember the rejectionist front of 1979 that opposed the Camp David agreements: Syria, Iraq, Iran. I would argue that it's no accident, to use a nice Soviet phrase, that those are the three states that Moscow is trying to bring into being today as its coalition: Assad's Syria, Iraq, and Iran. It is also no accident that these all happen to be Shiite states, and that they are opposed to the Sunnis, led by Saudi Arabia in many cases. So Iran is a partner for Russia as long as it does not do things that would invite even greater American presence or greater warfare in the Middle East. And the latter, of course, becomes much more important after the rise of ISIS, because of the connection that does exist between the terrorists and the jihadis in the North Caucasus and Russia proper, and in Syria, because they go back and forth. As a matter of fact, Moscow helped them go back and forth, which it does not like to advertise, because it felt quite cynically in 11, 12, and 13 that we might as well export our terrorists to somewhere else so they won't make trouble for us at home. It's much easier to deal with terrorists if they're in Syria than if they are in your country. So they let them go to Syria, but then they morphed into ISIS. And what's more, the terrorist problem in Russia grew. Muslim agitation inside Russia, Ural-Volga, Moscow area itself, North Caucasus has grown. And it's going to keep growing because domestically the Russians have no answer for it. They don't have an economic or ideological program that will stop this from growing. And what's more, demographically, Muslims are rising as a factor in Russian population. So it becomes all the more important to have this coalition as a prop or partner against the United States, because Russia sees itself, as the Soviet Union did, as a great power in the Middle East, which must be involved there because the Middle East is close to our borders, even though the borders today are 1,000 miles further away than they were 30 years ago. However, it's important for Russia that Iran not become a nuclear power, because the effort to go nuclear, they understood perfectly well, would lead to war. The last thing they wanted was a war which would bring American troops back into the Middle East in big numbers, and which would lead to American domination of the Gulf in even greater extent, and which could escalate out of control. So they wanted Iran to be non-nuclear, but they don't want it to be pro-Western. They seek Iran as a partner in this coalition, and they think it's vital to keep Iran on an anti-Western and anti-American track. Also, they do not want Iran exporting energy to Europe, because Iranian energy, first of all, is of a higher quality than Russia. Second, if Iran does export energy to Europe, either through the Gulf or through the Caspian Sea, it will create the southern gas corridor and the southern energy corridor that the EU and the United States have supported, compete with Russia, and it will be a better product than what Russia can offer, and Russian energy sales to Europe will suffer grievously. And that's what the government depends on for its foreign revenue and leverage in Europe. So again, it's important from an economic point of view to have Iran in Moscow's corner, and this is another reason why you see so many efforts by the Russians to gain influence on Iranian energy deals inside Iran. Third, Iran is a potential or actual major customer for Russian weapons, the S-300 in particular, the Russian air defense system. Russians did not sell it because the Israelis more or less told them, if you do, it will mean war. Now they're selling it because they know the Israelis will not strike, or they believe the Israelis will not strike Iran. And as a result, there's cover for them to do that. But the S-300 makes an American attack on Iran much more hazardous, as well as an Israeli attack, much more hazardous. They also understand that it's essential for Iran to be a partner of Russia because of Iran's great capacity for making trouble in the Caucasus and Middle East. Azerbaijan and Iran have come to blows many times about Iranian subversion there. None of the Central Asian states likes Iran or trusts it because they understand that it is a potentially subversive or actually subversive force. But the Russians are also happy to keep Caucasus states under Iranian pressure or to have Iran support Armenia against Azerbaijan because that justifies their security blanket that they want to throw over the Caucasus. So you have a complex series of motives why Russia supports Iran and why it is supporting Iran in Syria against the United States. Not only is Russia opposed to the idea of people power, to use the old Philippine phrase, which we saw in Syria in 2011, they are determined to protect their allies, to stick it to Washington, and show Washington that they are a great power without whom nothing can be done in the Middle East, and thus veto any unilateral use of American force or presence. And they want to create this abiding coalition in the Middle East. Moreover, as has always been the case, and as the historian Niall Ferguson has pointed out, Russia is the only great power that has no vital interest in stability in the Middle East. While it does not want a great power war, for reasons that I've made clear, it certainly is not unhappy to stir the pot. For example, the Russian government has made energy deals with both the Iraqi Kurds and the government in Baghdad. Because it is hedging its bets, it wants to play all sides against the middle. And now that the bottom has fallen out of Russo-Turkish relations, it has an excellent card with which to pressure Turkey should that become desirable and necessary. And it's clear to many observers that they may well do so. Furthermore, they are trying to keep Israel on their side to the extent that they can because of the fracturing of Israeli-American relations and because they see that an Israeli attack on Iran would lead to major war, and they don't want that to happen, and they have major commercial relations with Israel and are trying to get into Israeli energy equities, which are now quite big given the discoveries in the Middle East. Furthermore, Fahad may talk about this, they want to neutralize Saudi Arabia's connection to the United States, and they're going to exploit the Saudi disaffection with the Obama regime. And they're going to tell everybody that the Obama regime is lost, has no idea what to do in the Middle East, and is incapable of responding effectively to the crises, except by creating more crises through the undisciplined use of American power. The fact that the United States has not responded to Iran's violations of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Agreement with regard to missile tests, or that it made no response when there was almost a major naval incident in the Gulf between an Iranian ship and an American ship, would, I think, substantiate Russian claims about the incoherence and weakness of American policy. And certainly in Syria, we now see the administration backing away from Assad. So from the Russian point of view, there is everything to be gained and little or nothing to be lost from partnership, not alliance, partnership with both eyes open on both sides for Russia and Iran. Iran benefits by getting a partner who will sell it arms, who will support it to a certain degree against the United States and the West, who will help it with regard to obeying those aspects of the agreement that it wants to obey, for example, taking the spent nuclear fuel back to Moscow, and at the same time will help it sustain Assad and help it sustain Iran's investment in Middle Eastern terrorism. This last point has to be understood. all the major terrorist armies that are located in the Middle East, Hamas, Hezbollah, and now in Yemen, the Houthis, all get their arms from Iran or Syria, and those are Russian weapons, and Moscow knows full well to whom they're going, and Moscow is perfectly prepared to support these states or movements. It has said that Hamas was a legitimately elected government of Gaza, and that Hamas is not a terrorist organization, despite the fact they're continuing to send rockets on Israel. Hezbollah, which we've labeled the A-team of international terrorism, is a recipient of Russian arms, as is, and Assad's proclivities in this direction, as well as Iran's, are well known. So what we have is a totally cynical, opportunistic policy to play both ends against the middle and advance Russia as a major obstacle to any unilateral Western attempt to create some sort of legitimate order in the Middle East. And from Moscow's point of view, despite the complacency you get at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, that they're going to be trapped the way we were in Iraq, they are coming out ahead. They are achieving their political goals, even if they're paying more than they expected, and have run the risk of deteriorating relations with Turkey. Therefore, we may fully expect in the foreseeable future, at least I believe till the end of this administration, that Russo-Iranian relations will continue very much as they have in the past. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Hello? Okay. My mic on? I can't quite tell. Is it? Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here today. So, like Alex said earlier, the events of this past week have forced me to change my presentation quite dramatically, but I will get to the to Saudi-Russian and Saudi-Chinese relations at some point towards the end. Both, I think, are fascinating in their own right, and I hope to cover them a little bit. However, obviously, at the outset here, I will have to focus on Saudi-Iranian relations. Obviously, that has been in the news quite a bit over the past few days. And it seems to me that the Saudi Arabia's decision to sever diplomatic ties with Iran caught a lot of people by surprise. A day prior, its execution of 47 people whom it accused of committing various acts of terrorism seemed to shock a lot of people. Now, for me, as somebody who follows Saudi Arabia fairly closely, to be honest, I wasn't surprised by either. And in terms of severing of the diplomatic relations with Iran specifically, I think that the decision was a culmination of years of deteriorating relations, that at the heart of which I think is the Saudi-Iranian dispute over Syria. I think that for Saudi Arabia, Syria is the defining conflict of our era. I think they see it as having the potential to shape the political trajectory of the region for many, many years to come. In fact, I made this argument 3 years ago when I said that in some ways Saudi Arabia looks at Syria today, of course this was 2013, the way it did, the way it looked at the civil war in Yemen in the 1960s. I think it looked at that civil war as a way to take a stand against the expansion of Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and I think in the case of Syria today, it seems to be the place to take a stand against Iranian, what Saudi Arabia considers to be Iranian expansion in the region. So Syria is really a key to a lot of Saudi Arabia's calculations. So the war of words between Saudi Arabia and Iran has really been heating up, as I mentioned, over the past few months. I think that a couple of months ago, when there was a huge tragedy at the Hajj in Mecca in Saudi Arabia, again, from the Saudi perspective, Iran played politics with what was essentially a big tragedy, and various Iranian officials not only criticized Saudi Arabia's handling of the Hajj and the way they administered it, but some of them even suggested that an Islamic consortium of some sort should actually oversee the administration of the Hajj, because in their views, the Saudis are not up to the job. Which obviously the Saudis didn't see the humor in that. They thought it was an unacceptable interference in their domestic affairs, and even a call to interfere with their sovereignty. So
in addition to Syria, I think the Saudis, as I mentioned, have been complaining bitterly of what they see as Iranian meddling in countries across the region. They specifically point to Iraq. I've heard various Saudi officials say that Iran has undue and its influence in Iraq has increased quite a bit over the past few years, and to the word they use is to an unacceptable level. Going back to Syria, I think, as I said, this in the view of the Saudis, is the defining conflict of this era, and Iran is primarily, and has been up until very recently, until Russia decided to intervene militarily, has been Assad's primary backer. I think that from the Saudi view, ISIS, as we know it today, is a product of Syria. I think they point to the fact that prior to the Syrian war, ISIS might have its roots in Iraq, but the way it has metastasized and grown to what we know today, they blame that squarely on Assad's brutality against the majority Sunni population in Syria, and they also point that foreign fighters are going to Syria, not Iraq, and incidentally, the caliph, or the man who fancies himself as Caliph Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, has chosen Raqqa, not any other place, as his supposed capital. So Syria is key, and really, I think to understand the severing of relations with Iran and the executions of the 47 people, I think that one has to understand the wider context in which Saudi Arabia finds itself, which is, to a great extent, I mean, Saudi Arabia, I think, is still adjusting to the political realities of the post-Arab Spring world. I think that, like many other countries, Saudi Arabia was caught off guard. Very few people expected 2011 to turn out to be the seminal year that it did. The Saudis lost one of their biggest and most reliable allies in the person of President Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. But at the same time, again, from the Saudi view, not only did they lose some of their most reliable allies, but they also, some of their biggest foes, their primary foe, Iran's influence expanded, but also in the post-Arab Spring world, you have this monster that we now know as ISIS, and certainly which has declared its war against Saudi Arabia and has conducted some very brutal terrorist attacks, especially last year, attacking both Saudi Sunnis and Shia at their mosques, which incidentally Al-Qaeda never did 10 years ago, at least not to my knowledge. So in some ways, the Saudis feel that they have an acute sense that their security is being threatened, and the threats are coming from multiple fronts outside, from Iran on one side, from ISIS on another side, and again, there are ISIS sympathizers within Saudi Arabia. The Saudis have been, I think, surprisingly transparent in publicizing the many plots that they have foiled, the many people they have arrested for sympathizing with ISIS. And I think that's, going back to the question of the executions, that's how they view those 47 people. I think in some ways the government has made it clear that in its view, those were the worst of the worst, that they had been convicted of very serious terrorism-related crimes that targeted both Saudi civilians and military and security personnel, but they also targeted non-Saudis. Housing compounds were targeted, diplomatic missions. A couple of the people who were executed were charged for taking part in the attack against the U.S. consulate in Jeddah in 2004, and at least one person was implicated in the killing of an American contractor, and a couple of other people who were charged in the killing of a BBC reporter. So again, from the Saudi view, these were the worst of the worst. They had been on death row for years. They had exhausted all the appeals processes available, and that their time had come. At the same time, I think that there's also a message, in addition to the message they're sending to their Sunni militants and extremists, there's a message that was obviously sent to Shia extremists. And there are Shia extremists in the eastern province, and I'm talking here about the people who were involved in killing more than a handful of Saudi security officers. There have been some attacks, and for the most part, the people, and I think it was 4 Shia and 43 Sunnis who were executed on Saturday, were implicated in some of these very serious attacks in which people were killed in the eastern province, including obviously the controversial cleric Nimr. And obviously, much has been said and written about him in the West and elsewhere, and and the views on him vary widely. Some have portrayed him as a peaceful activist, whereas again, from the perspective or the view of the Saudi government, they considered him to be a hardened criminal who took a direct role in some terrorist attacks and in inciting people to carry out violent attacks against security personnel. And he was incidentally also injured while he was arrested. And again, exactly what happened there is in dispute. But he was shot, and there's some indication that he might have been resisting arrest. And again, from some Saudi sources, have maintained that he actually fired on security personnel as he was being arrested. So he was a controversial figure, I think. Everything that has to do with him has created some sort of controversy, from his speeches to his arrest to obviously his execution. I think at the very least, it's hard to argue that he wasn't a firebrand at the very least. If you listen to his speeches, he was controversial. He was not very accommodating. He did not seem to emphasize cooperating with the Saudis, and at least on one occasion, he seemed to suggest that that he was calling on his Shiite followers to overthrow the Al Saud regime. I attended actually a talk here in Washington, D.C., oddly enough, 2 or 3 years ago by another Shia cleric by the name of Hassan al-Saffar. And frankly, the contrast between al-Saffar and Nimr couldn't be more stark. Al-Saffar emphasized cooperation, accommodation, and talking to the Saudis. And although he did admit that much needs to be done in Saudi Arabia and the rights of Shias need to be expanded, but he said that there is progress has been made. From what I've seen of Nimr, that was not his narrative. Again, I think it was a lot more confrontational. But I think to understand both the executions and the severing of diplomatic relations, you have to understand this wider context, which I talked about earlier, and that's that the Saudis feel that the region is in the middle of unprecedented turmoil. And incidentally, I almost forgot to mention this, I think that the Saudis in some ways have not only adopted what people have described as a more assertive foreign policy, which you see an example of in terms of severing diplomatic relations with Iran, but I think they've adopted a strategic national narrative that has in some ways redefined what it means to be a Saudi abroad, for sure. And I think we see a dramatic manifestation of this new, more assertive foreign policy and more assertive ethos in the war in Yemen. Over the past 50 years, and because of its proximity, Saudi Arabia had become involved in one way or the other in all of Yemen's many conflicts over the years, but it had never taken the kind of military step or measure that it took last year. And that, I think, is a function of the new reality that Saudi Arabia finds itself in. Part of it, I think, a large part of it is due to the wide perception in Saudi Arabia and perhaps the wider Arab world, is that the Obama administration has decided to largely disengage from the region, and that it no longer feels that it has the moral responsibility to stabilize the area. I think that from the viewpoint of Saudi Arabia, that Obama's inclinations became painfully clear, or obviously clear, in the summer of 2013, when he seemingly reversed course on his self-imposed red line against using or striking Assad's forces in Syria. And in my reading, I think from that moment forward, Saudi Arabia has decided to take matters into its own hands. They have spent billions of dollars over the years on very advanced military equipment. They've spent billions of dollars on their military and training, and that they thought that given the turmoil in the region, this is as good a time to use some of this equipment and to see just how far we've come. Because it was very obvious, I think, in their view, that the United States and the wider international community had absolutely no interest in becoming involved in Yemen. And Yemen, I think, was Saudi Arabia's red line. And what made this crisis, I think, different in their view than past crises is the fact that you had, again, from their view, not one but two militant groups, one in the north, which is Houthi, Iranian-backed Houthis, and in the south you had a brutal Al-Qaeda affiliate known as the Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, both of whom, incidentally, have actually crossed the Saudi border and attacked Saudi personnel and killed a couple of them on occasion. So I'm being told I'm running late. Saudi-Russian relations are really interesting. I hope to get to them, but they've come under a lot of pressure and under a tremendous amount of strain because of Russia again. Because of Syria. Obviously, at this point, from the Saudi view, Russia has decided to side, to align itself with Bashar al-Assad, Iran, and Hezbollah, and that is obviously not going very well in Saudi Arabia. However, the Saudis have until very recently continued to talk with Putin, with the Russians, and if you read the Saudi media, Saudis, some Saudis at least, begrudgingly still respect Putin's resolve, and the fact that he seems to make resolute decisions and stick by them, and his tendency to take action. And again, that's, in their view, that's very different than what they've seen from the Obama administration. Saudi-Chinese relations, also very interesting. But I think the biggest appeal, you hardly ever hear anything about them, and that's a good thing, because I think in my view, Saudi-Chinese relations do not come with strings attached. And that's a good thing. For the most part, they revolve around oil. Saudi Arabia is the biggest exporter of oil in the world. China is the biggest importer. There's money back and forth, investments in refineries, natural gas fields, and the Saudis and Chinese have a business-like almost relationship. They don't interfere in each other's domestic policy, and I think both of them appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a very rich panel, and I have many questions. But for the sake of time and more questions for the audience, we're going to have quick questions and very quick answer as well. So please raise your hand, and someone will pass around with the microphone. I'll just start with the first question. To all three of you except the Chinese expert, because all three of you are energy exporters, and the prices of energy are pretty low now, and so all three countries are hurting. And my question is, can they break, will they break before this game is over, or do they have staying power to continue playing the game they've been playing for the past 2 years? Can maybe start with Ram.
Well, you're right. The Iranians are hurting because of the low price. But it seems to me, when listening to the Iranian oil minister, who seems to be backed by President Rouhani, they are willing to take this fight to the Saudis for bigger market share. I mean, if what he is saying, Zangane, then Iran is happy to sell oil at $10 a barrel, as long as Iran can, once the sanctions are lifted, and it can ramp up its the promised 500,000 extra barrels a day, then what the Iranians want is to go out there and regain the market share that they have lost since 2011. But one other quick thing I say about this is something I read yesterday, which is something for all of us to watch out for. Is, for instance, the tiny country of Djibouti this week broke relations with the Islamic Republic. I'm sure because the Saudis asked Djibouti to do so. But what I did not realize was Djibouti apparently sits in a place where it can decide how much transit fees the Iranians have to pay to get their crude oil from the bottom of the Red Sea to the Suez Canal. That's a fee to the country of Djibouti. Which, you know, again, is a surprise to me, can, if the Saudis ask them to, probably increase, which again, in this very tough economic environment, can make life for the Iranians that much harder. So these are the kind of things to watch out for if this rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia continues, how they're going to look for ways to hurt one another, which, by the way, is the saddest thing the Middle East could experience, but it is unfortunately experiencing.
Russia?
I would also say that all three players, all three exporters, are competing for market share, and therefore they're exporting more oil than ever before and actually contributing to the problem, because what you have now is a glut of oil supply on the market relative to very weak demand across the board, and China's demand is going down. because the Chinese economy is going to be in a very serious situation for at least the next 6 months. Any of you reads the, wakes up and hears what's happening in Shanghai, the stock exchange understands this. So they're all going to be cutting each other's throat, as Alex said, for the next 6 months at least, barring some major change in global economics or politics. And the price of energy will stay low. Remember, Goldman Sachs said it could go to 20, which may not be out of the inconceivable. But beyond that, can Russia survive it? Unlike most people in this town, if you read what's going on in Russia, you will see mounting signs of domestic stress and disaffection. The idea that Russia can just simply ride this out and that Putin is going to be able to ride this out, and not just Syria, but Ukraine, sanctions and everything else, I think is misconceived. He's going to do everything he can. And I wouldn't wake up tomorrow morning expecting the government to fall. But all the symptoms for a revolutionary crisis in Russia are coming together based on Russian history. They may not happen any time in the immediate 6 months, but they are going to make themselves felt with greater and more insistent urgency over the course of 2016. And I think by the end of this year, you will see quite a serious domestic problem in Russia, even if Putin is still in charge, which I expect.
Thank you. And
Yeah. I mean, the Saudis, it seems, have gotten the bulk of the. A number of people have accused them of orchestrating the steep drop in oil, and the Saudis are obviously trying to protect their market share. However, the suggestion that this was done strictly for political reasons to weaken both Iran and Russia, I find to be a little suspect, because the Saudis are as dependent on oil as any other country in the world. It still makes up 90% of their export earnings and 40% of GDP and 73% of government earnings. This past year, 2015, the Saudis incurred a budget deficit of $98 billion, which was the largest on record. They expect another deficit this year. So I don't think they like prices where they are now. They've actually had to also, they took a fairly dramatic measure in cutting energy subsidies, which was something that had been talked about for many years. This was a decision which was just made a couple of weeks ago. And while there are voices within Saudi Arabia that this was the right thing to do, and that some Saudis have had a sense of entitlement, and that they had to essentially, pay as much as other people around the world for many years. They have paid a fraction of what others pay for gasoline, for example, than their counterparts around the world. There is this view that the average Saudi citizen needs to do his share as a citizen. Now, on the other hand, there are people on Saudi social media who have expressed their concern and dismay, and saying that this budget shortfall should not fall on individual Saudis, that there has to be other ways of doing it. And in fact, there's been a number of prominent Saudis who have even pointed to Saudi Arabia's foreign aid to various countries. Egypt is one that I've heard a number of occasions. But I think if one looks at the Saudi budget over the past decades, really a couple of decades, the emphasis has been on creating jobs. It's been on going towards housing, education, so I foresee that as continuing. I think the Saudis realize that they have, considering the fact that the Saudi population has quadrupled since 1970, going from about 5 million to 20 million today. The economic challenges are perhaps as for the long term, I think, is as big as anything else, and the Saudis are well aware of it. The drop in oil has obviously been a great concern to them, but on the other hand, I haven't seen any indication that they're willing to revise their policy. They have essentially abandoned their traditional role as swing producer, and again, they don't see that the burden should fall on them to stabilize energy markets. They have basically said unless everybody pulls their weight, they're no longer going to bear that responsibility on their own.
We'll take 2 questions at a time. If you could, short question, thank you.
Mr. Garver, can you explain why Iran overlooks the fact that after North Korea, China is the most anti-religious regime in the world, and the fact that China routinely crushes Muslims, both Han Muslims and and Muslims in the west of the country. Is it the fact that those Muslims are Sunni why China gets a pass on this? Where's that sort of Muslim solidarity factor in with Iranian and Chinese relations?
Garver. The Baloch in Balochistan, Pashtun in Pashtunistan, and the Gilgit-Baltistan and East Turkestan are not sitting just watching. They're active. They don't allow China to go through. Thank you.
China is basically agnostic regarding the internal composition of states in the Middle East. China doesn't feel, if you look at the track two dialogues between China and Iran, in which these civilizational issues of gender equality or the role of religion in governance come up, the Chinese, of course, are on different sides of the divide than the Iranian participants. But the Chinese line is, that doesn't matter. Countries, the countries produce regimes and political systems which respond to their own, grow out of their own experience, historical experience, values, and those are idiosyncratic, and we can live with them. I mean, China has this omnidirectional friendship policy of being friends with everyone. And an important component of that is we don't care whether it's the Islamic Muslim Brotherhood or Hosni Mubarak or an Islamicist regime in Zia al-Haq or Benazir Bhutto. We can live with both of them. It doesn't matter.
More concerned about the Iranian side.
There were the Iranians mucking around in Xinjiang or in the Chinese fear of there is a real Chinese fear of Islamic contagion in Xinjiang. But there, China's modus operandi for handling this has typically been to work with the Pakistani government or the Iranian government. In the early 1990s, there was a group of the Iranian Islamic revolutionaries who were mucking around in Xinjiang. This is right after the breakup of the Soviet Union. Access to Xinjiang was more available. And China's approach to that was to go to the leaders of Iran and say, look, we want to expand relations, but the reality is we can't expand relations if there are people coming, doing these things in Xinjiang. And therefore, for the sake of cooperation between the countries, we hope that you will restrain these Islamic revolutionaries. And it worked. The same deal with Pakistan. Now, in the case of Pakistan, the regional separatism is an obstacle. But China's doing a number of things. One is that they've started negotiating deals, arrangements with local authorities. But they also work with Pakistan's central government. But I mean, the obstacles you speak of Baluchi objection to.
There's two questions on the second row.
Yes, I have a question for Mr. Nazer.
Yeah.
Your description of the executed imam ranged from the Saudis' list of his alleged terrorist activities to his just being a firebrand, but the consensus of the world in condemning it seems to be that the terrorist aspects were overstated. My question is, as an expert on Saudis, do you believe they're including him in the group that was killed was really because of his terrorist activities or because they wanted to ratchet up tension with Iran in the hopes that might affect U.S. rapprochement with Iran or other things?
And your neighbor, if you could. Thank you.
Yes, I actually have two questions. One of them is specifically related to the topic of today, which is China and Iran in terms of their relationship in the future. So in that context, I think I've been to Iran multiple times, and I can tell you, Chinese do not have a good reputation when it comes to products and investments in Iran. They're viewed as low quality, cheap exporters and investors. And in fact, last March for the Nowruz, their premier was blaming the Iranian leadership for importing cheap Chinese food instead of, and Chinese goods instead of actually taking up the position that we do better. So in terms of the future, therefore, I think the relationship between China and Iran, as opposed to Iran and Europe, in terms of investments, looking for investments and trade and things like that, I think, or my question is, do you think that there will be a problem in terms of the extent that we think it will happen? The second thing in terms of the Saudis, so we have a succession crisis in Saudi Arabia, we have a financial crisis, and also it so happens that a week before we do have the review of the sanctions lift, we get people killed and beheaded and all of that stuff. So to what extent do you think this is, again, Saudi meddling and trying to cause problems at the wrong time for the Iranians, at the right time for themselves?
So first Fahad Nazer and Messi after Professor Garver.
Yeah, so in terms of the execution, the gentleman's question just right now, I think Saudis would find the notion that they're executing of 47 Saudis as meddling. I think they'd find it very puzzling because I should correct it. There was one Egyptian and one Chadian. So if there are two countries who, again, from the Saudi perspective, who maybe would have a right to criticize the execution, it would be either China or Chad. Yeah, sorry, I was just answering the gentleman next to you. In terms of the motive, so I've heard various Saudi officials talk about exactly why they did it, and a very interesting interview yesterday was granted by the Saudi Foreign Minister Adel Jubeir, and he was very, very direct in saying that, again, these were 45 Saudis who were convicted or in charge of committing terrorist acts inside Saudi Arabia, and so he seemed fairly puzzled as to what is it to Iran. Iran, by some counts, has executed more than 600 people last year alone. Over the years, they've executed some Sunni clerics, but the Saudis have not condemned those executions in any way. So the way they're seeing it is, this is again a blatant interference in a purely domestic issue. That again they were not Iranian citizens. They were not. The crimes were not committed outside of Saudi Arabia. And again, the overwhelming majority were Sunni militants. There's been very little. Well, what's interesting is that there's been condemnation of the killing of some of the Shia militants, but very little of the Sunni militants, which is interesting. I think the consensus seems to be that those people who most if not all of whom were affiliated in some way with Al-Qaeda did go through the legal process and got their comeuppance at the end. But it seems that the same people who seem to be justifying their execution seem to have an issue with the execution of Shia militants. I think, again, from the Saudi perspective, this is acknowledgement that there are militants of both strands, both Shia and Sunnis, and that if there's a message, it's a message to Saudi Arabia's own militants. And again, 2015, I think, was one of the most brutal years in Saudi Arabia's history in terms of the terrorist attacks it suffered. I think that, again, these were mostly ISIS sympathizers, but still, I think it really brought back memories of 2003, and I think it shone a light on just what kind of a threat they're facing from ISIS going forward, and they wanted to clearly send a message to ISIS and its sympathizers, and there are hundreds of militants connected in some way or the other to ISIS in Saudi jails. I wouldn't be surprised if they get executed shortly as well. And again, I think if one looks at just how brutal the attacks have been, I mean, these have been against civilians in mosques. They've killed children in both Shia and Sunni mosques indiscriminately. Suicide attacks, I might add, inside mosques. So it really doesn't get worse than that. And I think the Saudis, from everything I've heard from them, if there's a message, it's this message that, well, going forward, there will be a zero tolerance policy. We cannot have, the message is also obviously directed to Shia militants who, some of whom were convicted of, because there have been attacks against Saudi security personnel in the eastern province as well. So the message seems to be targeted primarily at those two audiences, in my view.
Professor Garver and Vatanka on the
Yeah.
Iran-Chinese trade.
It's true that the products like compressors or generators or machine tools, Chinese are typically lower quality than European. But on the other hand, they're cheaper, and that's an advantage. But there's another area in which China has a strong competitive advantage. That's infrastructure, in terms of building high-speed rail lines or highway systems comparable to the U.S. interstate system, or large container ports. You know, the largest ports in the world are in China, built by Chinese firms, operated by Chinese firms. HPH in Hong Kong is a Chinese firm. In terms of internet systems, Huawei is these Chinese are building lots of big buildings very quickly. China has certain very strong comparative advantages. If you want to rapidly develop a country, China, in terms of providing infrastructure, has a very strong comparative advantage. Secondly, China is in the midst of a drive to move up the value-added ladder, to stop producing low-tech, labor-intensive goods, but produce high-tech goods. And this is facilitated by huge funding from the government, subsidies, technology import subsidies, and so forth. It's supported by indigenous, a whole set of programs. So the Chinese view is that, as China's exports move up the value-added ladder, the low quality will be replaced by higher quality. In terms of will China be second to Iran, to the EU, well, the way my Chinese interlocutors explain this to me, well, yeah, it could well be. Because there's all sorts of cultural reasons, cultural affinities, and as you say, European goods, German, Italian machine tools are higher quality and probably will be for a long time than Chinese machine tools. But on the other hand, Chinese machine tools are good enough in many cases. There's appropriate technology, they're a lot simpler to operate. And if you're dealing with people that are just moving from the farms to the factories, appropriate technology of some other medium-range technology might be a lot better than more advanced Italian or German machine tools. So the Chinese view is not that China will have some lock on Iran, but that China will be an important player in this very large market, although it might be second to Iran. So second to the EU. So what? Iran's still a big market. China with Chinese products will be part of it.
If I may, just quickly wanted to make a comment on your point about the Uyghurs in China and the Iranian reaction to it. I just think it's important to bear in mind the Iranians, when they go out there, propagate a certain Islamist narrative, they have invariably only done so in environments where there's fertile ground. So if you look at it, since the biggest foreign policy success of Iran is the creation of Hezbollah in the early 1980s out of the chaos of Lebanon. The second biggest one is arguably what they've done in Iraq because Saddam Hussein was toppled. Yugoslavia civil war, that's the only time we see the Iranians show their faces in Europe, when there's chaos. When there's no chaos, in places like Chechnya or Kashmir or in Xinjiang, the Iranians are not going to rock the boat. And that seems to be clear how they played. In terms of the Chinese and the economy, I just think it's important to bear in mind there are things that are against China and there are things that are for it. One of the things clearly in my mind when I look at the Chinese, how they trade with the Iranians that goes against them is, in early 2014, Ayatollah Khamenei came out and declared, and he said, look, to Rouhani, I want independence to the extent that we can get it as far as the economy is concerned, what he labeled self-sufficiency. A big part of this idea of self-sufficiency is bring know-how to Iran, enable Iranians to produce on Iranian soil, no longer just ship the crude oil out and get the money in. That doesn't work. That's a lesson to learn from the sanctions when they're isolated. Now, the Chinese, apparently when they trade, and negotiate contracts with the Iranians want to sell a lot of small bits and bobs here and there as part of the deal, which angers the Iranians because a lot of that stuff they can do themselves. And that's why they're now looking to the Europeans in ways they haven't in the past. Because the Europeans, and if, God forbid, the Americans one day get to go to the Iranian market, are much better at not confusing the Iranians about all the things that they want to throw in the package. But look, what's in it for China? Or what goes in favor of China? When you are exporting 1.1 million barrels a day, and 500,000 goes to China alone, that makes China a player that any leader in Tehran has to take into account, at least for now. So that one, they certainly have in their favor. And my last point is this. Please, if you get a chance, you want to kill some time, look at the leadership, look at the top characters who are in what I call the Hassan Rouhani inner circle. Look at them, look at their identities, look where they come from, where they grew up, where they were educated, and you see a long list of people who come from same social background, mostly educated in business studies and so on during the days of the Shah, many of whom studied in the United States, in other words, are Western-centric. And then in turn, look at the IRGC people or people associated with IRGC, have no connection to the West. What they know is the East. It's Russia, it's China, elsewhere, Bulgaria, you name it. So you have that as part of this competition for economics benefit. Because a lot of folks in Tehran aren't just listening to the foreign policy rhetoric. They're worried about getting hit in their pockets in terms of where Rouhani decides to take the country. And that's where a good part of this fight in Iran is happening right now.
Thank you very much. We are, unfortunately, it looks like we just started, but we're out of time. And we have to end this panel. The events are going to continue next week and next month. You give us a lot of things to think about and to watch for as things unravel. Thank you so much to all the panelists, and thank you for coming.